But first, though, a slice of typically aspirational Australia will this Saturday cast a vote in a by-election in southeast suburban Melbourne. I say typical because, and I know this area well, the median age there is 39. Younger families, many renting because 13 rate rises later, they can't afford a home loan. The area is typical of many Australian commuter suburbs. It's growing in number. At last census, I looked up today, around 140,000 people live in Frankston alone. That's at Dunkley Centre. A population swollen by home hunters from closer into Melbourne, trying to get cheaper housing, and migrants trying to get a foothold. These are the people once referred to as John Howard's battlers, a reference, of course, to John Howard and Western Sydney in the early 2000s. And these are the people, if Peter Dutton wants to win a federal election this year or next, that Dutton has to appeal to. By-elections are typically tricky to predict, and Labor holds this seat by a fraction over 6%. Around Australia, I'm told there are 12 federal seats with slimmer margins than that. Make no mistake, Saturday and the Dunkley result is going to have a major impact on the futures of both Peter Dutton and the Prime Minister. Now, the quality of individual candidates and the raft of independent and minor candidates running is almost irrelevant. This is a poll of 111,000 registered voters on the biggest issues, mainly the cost of living, and who those 111,000 voters blame for mortgage increases, crippling rents, power bills that never went down as Labor promised they would, petrol prices and checkout pain at Coles and Woolies and Aldi. It's also a poll on something politicians on both sides don't really want to talk about, immigration. More particularly, how many people are coming into Australia and where they're coming from. People are not mugs. They know jamming another 750,000 people into largely Sydney and Melbourne is unsustainable. Official figures from the Bureau of Stats as of December last year showed that migrant arrivals were up a staggering 73% to 730,000, up from 427,000 a year earlier. More than half of those were temporary visa holders, the sort of people who gravitate to places like Frankston in search of cheaper rent. Now, Labor's had its finger on the fast forward button when it comes to migration, and many Australians, me included, believe it's time to hit the pause button. Now, Melbourne is set to become Australia's biggest capital city by population as soon as 2025 next year. Dunkley is also on the fringes of a serious crime spree involving gangs of young home invaders, terrifying residents asleep in their beds at night, confronted with weapons and having their cars stolen and torched. Frankston itself, it's got its own issues with homelessness, drugs, youth unemployment and petty crime. Now, my colleague Paul Murray is in Frankston tonight and will bring you an edition of his famous by-election pub test, with locals able to fire questions at candidates. I'll join him there after a dash from here to Frankston. You want me to tell you who won't be there tonight? And I believe this is an outrage for the voters in that seat. Labor has banned their candidate, or she might have banned herself. Jodie Bellier will not be attending, and neither will some bloke called Alex Breskin, who is the Greens candidate. You wonder what they might be afraid of. A tough question for Labor, maybe, on migration, or that power bill that was a broken promise, or for the Green bloke on how he expects the good people of Dunkley to be able to splash out on buying an electric vehicle. It's a gutless decision and a statement of what to expect if either of them were to be elected. You'd be voting for someone who goes missing when the going gets tough. The Libs' Nathan Conroy will front up, and I presume a number of the fringe candidates. I'll get an idea from my first panel up next. Experienced political operative Michael Kroger and Rashina Campbell from the Melbourne City Council, and someone who herself has stood for a by-election in a federal by-election.